by Abai in October 2016. Secresy, or The Ruin on the Rock by Eliza Fenwick. Volume 1, Letter 3. From Caroline Ashburn to Sibella Valmont. Thankful to Mr. Valmont for his consent to my request, and more endeared to you, my Sibella, by the joy with which you receive his consent, I am impatient till I have explained the motives that withheld me, while in the woods of Valmont, from saying, I love you, Sibella, with all my soul. To have these motives fully understood by you, it is necessary I should make a sketch of my education, the incidents of my life, and their consequent effect upon my character. Yet I know you will continue to read with avidity. Ask yourself if the ear of affection is easily satiated with the communications of a friend, and wonder that you should have repressed your wishes when they incited you to unfold to me with minute attention the feelings of your heart. The breaks, the allusions in your letter, led me for a time into the tormenting and silly practice of forming conjectures. Now I have ceased to conjecture, but I have not ceased to be desirous of being admitted to your utmost confidence, to the full participation of your remembrances, whether of joy or of sorrow. You have seen my mother, Sibella, but people of a superior class must have superior forms, and the endearing name of mother is banished for the cold title of ceremony. Mrs. Ashburn, as I am now tutored to call her, was the very fashionable daughter of very fashionable parents, who died when she had attained the age of 23, and left her in possession of the most aspiring longings after splendour and dissipation, but destitute for every means for their gratification. Among the many friends who came to pity or advise, one offered her his assistance. His proposal was abrupt and disgusting, but there was no alternative. He would equip her to go in search of a wealthy marriage among the luxurious inhabitants of India, or, with her other professing friends, he would leave her to the poverty which lay immediately before her. The offer, after little deliberation, was accepted. Rather than be poor, she humbled the pride of her birth and pretensions. She strengthened her nerves for the voyage, and, having safely arrived in India, her recommendations, but above all her personal charms, secured her the addresses of Mr. Ashburn, who, though he was neither young nor attractive, had gold and diamonds in abundance. A very short interval elapsed between the commencement of their acquaintance with each other and the celebration of their marriage. After my birth, my father bowed to no other idol than me, for although my father had gained a very handsome wife, and my mother almost the wealthiest of husbands, yet happiness was still at a distance from them. Indolent in the extreme, he abhorred every species of pleasure which required a portion of activity in its pursuit. He equally abhorred solitude, and expected to find in his wife a lounging companion, a partaker of his habits, something little differing from a mere automaton. She, on the contrary, was laborious in the pursuits of pleasure and dissipation. She had pride and spirit to maintain her resolution of gratifying her own wishes. He was too idle to remonstrate, and theirs was a union as widely removed from the interruptions of bickerings and jealousies as from the confidence, esteem, and endearments of affection. From me, then, my father expected to gain the satisfaction his marriage had failed to afford, nor were his hopes better founded than heretofore. Admired, adored by him, flattered by his slaves, incited by indulgencies showered upon me without distinction to make demands the most extravagant and unattainable, I oftener tormented my father by my caprice than delighted him by my fondness. But still every species of advice or of restraint was withheld, and I continued fruitful in expedients for the exercise of my power, continued the discontented slave of my own tyranny. Happily for me, I met with an adventure when I was little more than 13 years of age, that wrought miracles upon me. Near to a seat of my father's, as near as the cottage of poverty dare rise to the palace of opulence, lived the wife and family of a poor industrious European. The blue eyes of one of their children had spoken so submissively once or twice, as she viewed me passing, that I became enamoured of her interesting countenance, and demanded to have her for a playmate. Day after day Nancy came, and my fondness for her increased daily. If the turbulence of my temper sometimes broke loose in the course of our amusements, I afterward endeavoured, by increased efforts of condescension, to relieve Nancy from the terror my pride or violence had excited, and to impress her with a strong sense of my attachment to herself. In her presence I affected to be more than commonly overbearing and insolent to those around us, while to her I was attentive and obliging. At length I became resolved to have her wholly at my command, and, without troubling myself to inquire whether or not my father would object to my plan, I rose earlier than usual one morning and dispatched a messenger for Nancy, and, while he was absent, pleased myself with anticipating what answers she would make, and what joy she would evince, when I should tell her that henceforward she should live with me, and should have as fine clothes, as fine apartments, as many slaves to obey her as I myself possessed. My messenger returned alone. He told me Nancy was ill. What a disappointment! How insolent, methought, to be ill, when I wanted her more than I had ever wanted her before! And so much did she appear to merit my resentment, that I gave orders she should be forbidden to see me again, and that all the valuable trinkets I had heaped upon her should be taken from her by force, if she would not yield them when demanded. But no sooner were the toys brought into my presence than I relented, sent them back with many additions, and wept while I delivered messages, entreating that she would be well by the next day. On the morrow, still no Nancy came, and I passed the day in alternate paroxysms of rage and sorrow. The third morning I hastened to the cottage, and the first object I beheld was Nancy, blooming as health could make her. The insolence with which I reproached the mother of Nancy on this occasion may be easily imagined, but I shall relate minutely to you, Sibella, the good woman's answer. I have never forgotten it. Miss, she said, I might as well have told the truth at once, for out it must. Nancy is not sick in body, miss, and if I can help it she shan't be sick in mind. Your papa is a great rich man, and you will be a great rich lady. You, miss, who are so high-born and so rich, need not care if people do hate you. But my Nancy is a poor child, and will never have a penny that aunt of her own earning. She never used to fleer, and flout, and stamp at her little brothers and sisters, as she does since she came to your house, miss. And so, miss, as she will never be able to pay folks for saying she is good when she is bad, I, who am her mother, must make her as good as I can. You may be good enough for a great lady, but Nancy will never be a great lady, and, be as angry as you will, miss, indeed she can't come to your fine house any more. Yes, Sibella, she persisted, in defiance of my resentment and its probable consequences. The worthy woman persisted in preserving her child from the infectious example of my vices. Her lesson had awakened in my mind a true sense of my situation, nor could anger or disdain once force me from the painful conviction that people were hired and paid to lavish on me their insincere encomiums. All the instances of attention or kindness I could recollect, I believed had been mine only because I was rich and powerful. I imagined I saw lurking hatred and loathing in every eye, and though I ceased to command, I resented with an acrimony almost past description every effort that was directed towards increasing my pleasures or convenience. These ebullitions of a wounded vanity insensibly wore away, while I considered how much of amendment and happiness was yet in my power, and at length I began seriously to remedy the defects which had made me unworthy to be the companion of Nancy. But, ere I had courage to demand again the society of my little friend, her parents had removed to a distant part of the country, and in this instance frustrated the end of my labours. Yet the labour itself had become delightful, and was amply rewarded by the satisfaction betrayed in the eyes of my numerous attendants, but who, however, as I was a great lady and a rich lady, durst not openly rejoice in my amendment. I longed to hear them burst into praises. I almost sickened for the accents of a well-earned commendation, but shame of my former unworthiness, and perhaps a remaining degree of pride, withheld me from encouraging such an explanation, and they continued silently to receive the benefits of my reformation. And now, Sibella, I must bring you back again to my mother, with whom in these years of childhood I have been but little acquainted. She hated children. Their noise and prattle and monkey tricks threw her into hysterics. For a few minutes after dinner I was sometimes admitted, hushed to silence with a profusion of sweetmeats, and dismissed with a kiss or a frown, just as the avocations and pleasures of the day happened to fix her disposition. As I grew older, I was occasionally allowed to sit in her dressing-room, or to take the air with her in the same carriage, and on those occasions I reached the highest pinnacle of her confidence, and used to listen while she poured forth her longing desires to return to England. As I had been frequently disgusted at witnessing the malignant feuds existing among the Europeans resident in the East Indies, it was easy for her to interest me in the first of her wishes, namely, that my father would return to England. She spoke of this island as of the abode of pleasure. She described an almost innumerable circle of friends, amidst whose society delights would abound. My imagination gave a stronger colouring to her pictures. I indulged the visionary theme till I also panted to become an inhabitant of this climate of peace, joy, and felicity. No sooner had I adopted the project than my father's lethargic indolence gave way to his desire of gratifying my wishes. He vigorously completed the necessary arrangement of his affairs, and we were in daily expectation of quitting India, when he was attacked by the malignant disease of which he died. My mother was now the uncontrolled mistress of a world of wealth, and, placing her remittances in a proper train, we speedily set sail for our land of promise. Safely arrived in London, I expected Mrs. Ashburn would instantly fly to the embraces of her friends. But no! A sumptuous house and equipage were first to be prepared, and, while she exulted in preparation, I repined at her want of sympathy for the feelings of those who I imagined were expecting her with fondness and impatience. Alas, Sibella, I had not followed my mother 3 times into her circles of friendship, ere I discovered that the enjoyments she had looked forward to, during so many years, consisted only of triumphing with superiority of splendour over those who formerly, with the same motives, had triumphed over her. Here my enthusiasm in the search of sincere and uniform friendship would have been extinguished, but that my hopes yet rested on Mrs. Valmont. Of Mrs. Valmont my mother had spoken as playmate, schoolmate, and the confidant of juvenile secrets. Separated, I said to myself, nearly 20 years, what emotions must a first interview produce? The fire of youth in Mrs. Valmont and Mrs. Ashburn will be, for some moments, renewed, and I shall anticipate the effusions of my own heart when it finds a friend. After exhibiting our pomp at every place of resort in the metropolis, we began our tour, and passed by several invitations to pay our first visit at Valmont Castle. What a freezing sensation crept in my veins as we waited for the raising of your uncle's drawbridges, as we rolled along his dark avenues. Such gloom, such menacing grandeur brought into my mind a feeling totally opposite to the hilarity, the glow of expectation I had cherished on the journey. Many persons had spoken in my hearing of Mr. Valmont as the most absurd, ridiculous misanthrope of his age, but I had not the highest respect for the authorities from which the information was derived, and I had also conceived with much more fancy than judgment of the delights of a life of solitude. I, in my dream, had forgotten the name of castle, and the ideas associating with the name. My imagination in its reveries had blended elegance and simplicity, nature and art with their most fascinating productions, when, instead of smiling lawns and gay parterres, without I found moats, walls, and drawbridges, frowning battlements that looked as uninviting on the friend as threatening on the enemy, turrets all cheerless, all hostile and discouraging to the wandering stranger. The castle's Gothic magnificence within reminded us at every step of the dignity of the Valmont race. The apartments received their guests without welcome. The domestics were obedient, but neither cheerful nor attentive. Through carved saloons and arched galleries, into which the bright sun of spring can only cast an oblique ray, we were conducted to Mrs. Valmont's dressing-room. My Sibella, can you not imagine you hear your aunt mingling complaint and compliment, languor and restlessness, and labouring to interest real sensibility by moans of imaginary disease? Can you not imagine my mother secretly urging her triumphs over the immured Mrs. Valmont, by lamenting the slavery of pleasure to which she herself is perpetually compelled? And can you not see your disappointed, disgusted Caroline Ashburn viewing caresses without warmth, hearkening to professions without sincerity? Your uncle entered the room for a moment. Appearing to act, to speak, to look according to some rule settled for the hour, I deemed his character too much assumed to be quickly understood. From the solemn pride which sat on his brow, I judged, however, that he was fitted for his castle, and his castle fitted for him. Here, thought I, in this place and with these people have we promised to remain for 7 long days, and I quitted Mrs. Valmont's dressing-room to search for amusement and variety in the park and surrounding woods. I must have been devoid of taste and feeling, if in viewing the exquisite scenery of the park I had not forgotten the gloomy entrance and the dreary building. I found a seat on the margin of that fine sheet of water which is skirted by your majestic wood, and I rested there till twilight began to spread itself over the horizon. Who would not, Sibella, although evening had cast its misty shade over the tall trees, and impressed an awful serenity on every surrounding object, who would not, I say, like me, have ventured into the wood rather than have returned to Mr. and Mrs. Valmont and their castle? I found the paths so admirably contrived in their breaks and windings that I could not forbid myself to proceed. Every now and then I had an imperfect view of something dark, rugged, and mountainous. On a sudden I caught a glimpse of a rude pile of stones, seemingly carried to a tremendous height, which as suddenly vanished from my sight, amid the intercepting branches. A few steps further, it was again before me as a wild ruin tottering on the projecting point of a rock. Silence, solitude, the twilight, the objects filled my mind with a species of melancholy. Fancy had become more predominant than judgment. I slackened my pace, I breathed heavily, when, suddenly turning into a new path that I expected would bring me to the foot of the rock, I beheld a female form, clothed in white, seated at the foot of a large oak. Her hair, unrestrained by either hat or cap, entirely shaded her face as she bowed her head to look on a little fawn, who, in the attitude of confidence and affection, was laying across her lap. The names of wood nymph, dryad, and hymadriad, with a confused number of images, arose in my memory, and I was on the point of reverently retreating, but a moment's pause prevented the romance of the fence from thus imposing on my reason, and I resolved to examine whether the face, like the form, bespoke more of divinity than of mortal. As I approached nearer, away bounded the fawn, up sprang the nymph. Again, Sibella, I stood still, unknowing whether to fall at your feet or to clasp you in my arms. Such was our first romantic interview. There was something wild in your air, your language was simple and concise, yet delivered with an impressive eloquence, and I thought you altogether a phenomenon. My heart could not help partaking the transport with which you received my promise of staying with you in the wood. Yet it was to me incomprehensible how you could talk so familiarly of roaming in woods at night, without seeming to know anything of the ideas of loneliness and apprehension generally supposed to belong to such situations. But my habits would not so suddenly yield to yours. You saw that the damp and darkness affected me, and you instantly led the way to the castle. But you became silent, you sighed, you walked at a greater distance from me, and I began to fear lest you could only submit to be pleased in your own way. The instant we entered the outer court of the castle you seized my hand, and, having pressed it forcibly to your bosom, you darted through a small door in the building, and closed it after you. I was going to follow. "This way, if you please, madam," said the servant who had been sent to search for me in the park. "I will accompany Miss Valmont," I said. "Miss Valmont does not see company, madam," replied the man. "Her uncle does not permit it." I suffered myself to be conducted to the supper-room, where I related the manner of our meeting, the information you had given me of your relationship to Mr. Valmont, and finally I spoke of the singular way in which you had quitted me, and expressed my surprise at not finding you of the supper-party. Mrs. Valmont said you were a strange, unformed child. Mr. Valmont would gladly have been silent, but, as I continually addressed myself to him, he could not rid himself, without gross rudeness, of the necessity of answering me. He spoke mysteriously of his systems and his plans, of his authority, his wisdom, and your dependence, of his right of choosing for you, and your positive duty of obeying him without reserve or discussion. At last, with tones and gestures by which I was to understand that he went to the extreme of condescension in my favour, he consented that, provided no other company came to visit him in the time, you should associate with us while we remained at Valmont Castle. Your very extraordinary seclusion and your extraordinary self occupied my mind during the greatest part of that night. I had found you highly interesting, and I believed you to be infinitely amiable. I thought I might embrace you as the first choice of my affections, but I doubted whether you might not, if now exposed to the glitter of the world, lose that vigour of feeling which in solitude made you appear so singular, so attractive. I longed to make the experiment, for my hopes of you were stronger than my fears, and, as I had so far prevailed on Mr. Valmont, I flattered myself I should also prevail on him to suffer me to conduct you from the castle. And these were the motives, this the expectation, dearest Sibella, that withheld me from confessing in Valmont woods that I loved you with all my soul. The 7 days I remained at the castle I forbore, although with difficulty, to ask you questions, that I might gradually develop your character, as surrounding circumstances should operate on your feelings. Sometimes I saw you devoted to me. Sometimes I saw your imagination soaring, as it were beyond the bounds prescribed to your person, in search of a remoter object. Why, dear Sibella, are you so pensive? Why do you gaze on that portrait of yourself with so much earnestness? And why do you caress that little fawn, who wears a collar inscribed with the initials C.M., till your eyes fill with tears? Let me be the partaker of your unrestrained emotions, while I, who have a wider range of observation, will place my opinions before you without check or limit. Our next resting-place is to be the seat of a nabob, Sir Thomas Barlow's, among whose laboured pleasures I shall wish to return to gloomy Valmont, where I found a felicity of which I have no promise in the scenes I am now destined to partake. Adieu. Adieu. Caroline Ashburn. End of section 3.